Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Abby and I'm the designer behind Sew Homey. I really want to thank you for joining me today. Now in this video I'm going to show you how to seam together a crochet cardigan. Now I will be using the mattress stitch because I love how invisible it is and how it doesn't leave a bulky seam. So this design is called Mountain Peaks Cardigan and it is by Janine Myska, and it was a pattern test actually that I completed for her book that is getting released in November of 2021. So I'll add all of that information in the description box below. Now, I actually talk about this design in a lot more detail in my podcast episode number 5. So I will link it up here for you guys if you are interested in learning more about it. But for now, we're going to stick to just the seaming part of this tutorial. And I really hope that this helps somebody because I really needed a video like this a few years ago. The number of pieces to crochet for a cardigan can vary depending upon the pattern. Now the pattern that I followed had me crochet 5 separate pieces, which is very common for cardigans. So I just want you to keep that in mind throughout this video. Now the first piece that is being drawn right now is the back panel. Now this is the biggest piece that is made to fit the width of your shoulders. The next are the 2 front panels. These are typically made as mirror images of each other if there's any shaping, and they do go in the front, one on each side. Now both are less than half the size of the back panel. That way, after they are seamed to the back piece, there is still room for your neck to fit whenever you go to wear your cardigan. And then the last 2 pieces are the sleeves, which should look identical, yet this can be very hard at times, I know. So once you have all 5 pieces crocheted, it's time to assemble the entire cardigan. So I like to begin with the shoulder seams, which I have highlighted in red. This will attach the front panels to the left and right side of the back panel. So next, the 2 sides can be seamed together, which I have this highlighted in yellow. And at this point, you will basically have a vest because you will leave enough room at the top for your sleeves to fit in. That's why that yellow line isn't drawn all the way to the top, because you need to leave room for the sleeves on both sides. So finally, the sleeves are seamed to either side of the cardigan, and this finishes the assembly of your cardigan. So this is what it will look like whenever you're finished. And the rest of this video will follow these exact steps, and I will show you in real time how to seam a crochet cardigan together. Here is my actual cardigan, and all of the pieces have already been blocked and most of my ends are woven in at this point. Now what you see here is the back panel and the 2 front panels that are ready to be seamed along the tops of the shoulders. But before we start seaming, you want to make sure that the front sides of the fabric are facing outward. So I'll quickly show you how to do this. But first, I want to go ahead and remove one of the front panels because I will only be seaming 1 piece at a time. For my cardigan, the pieces were crocheted from the bottom up, so I will be looking at the first row of my stitches, which is located at the bottom of the cardigan. However, this might be different for you, so just go ahead and find that first row that you crocheted. You'll notice right here that I have a hem, and technically these were my first rows that I crocheted, but they look vertical now because I wanted that ribbed look. But right here is my first row that I crocheted on top of the hem, and this is where I want to start. I know that the front side of the fabric, whenever I look at this first row of stitches, I should be looking at the front side of the stitch. And I did use a half double crochet, and I know that the back of the stitch actually looks like this. It has a long line across the back of it. So I know that that's the back of the stitch, and then that first row below the back of the stitch is the front side. So I know that this is the front side of the fabric. Now I want to do the same thing for my back panel. I want to make sure I know which is the right side of the fabric. Now, technically, since I had my front panel on this one, I want the inside to actually be the inside of the cardigan, so it'll be the wrong side, which you can see by that first row of stitches. You can see that line going across the back of the stitches or of the half double crochets, which means that I do have the wrong side of the fabric facing me, which again is what I want based on how I had my cardigan laid out on the table. However, whenever you're seaming, you want both sides of the fabric to have the right sides facing up. So when I go to seam the cardigan, I want this side right here, I want this side facing up. So all I've done is move my panels a little in a different position. I have my back panel on the left and my front panel on the right, and I have both sides of the fabric facing me to do this seaming technique. Now I will be using what is called the mattress stitch to seam along the shoulder piece. So go ahead and thread your tapestry needle. So whenever I threaded my tapestry needle, I did leave a long yarn tail attached to the cardigan, so I don't have to attach any loose yarn to this. However, it's not a problem if that's what you have to do. Just go ahead and attach it, and we'll get to seaming with the mattress stitch. So I have my pieces lined up, and since I'm going to be seaming stitch by stitch, I don't actually have any stitch markers holding this fabric together. I don't find that I need that whenever I'm going along the tops of the stitches, which you can see here, because we will be using the V's, which illustrate the tops of the stitches. This is what we'll be seaming with. So the front panel has the tops of the stitches here, and you can also see that the back panel has the same exact thing. These V's each mean that it's the top of a stitch, and that is what we will be using to seam the shoulders together. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and begin seaming. And since my thread is attached to the right side, I'm going to go ahead and take my needle and insert it into the first stitch on the left, or the back panel. And I want to take my needle and I'm going to go through the back of the stitch to the front. And again, the top of that first stitch is going to be that V. And I'm making sure to go through both loops. Then I'll go ahead and pull that yarn all the way through, which my piece is probably way too long, but I know that I will have enough. So I have it on the left side, and now I'm going to take my needle over to the right side with the front panel piece, and I'm going to do the same. I'm going to insert my needle from the back to the front and go through both loops of that V for that first stitch. And then I have completed seaming together the first stitch on both sides. So we're just going to continue the same exact motion and work our way up to the very last stitch. So here's that next stitch, and inserting my needle. This was from right to left, the way that I'm holding that fabric, or from the back to the front. And then I pull that yarn all the way through, and then I zigzag back over to the right panel piece, and I go through that second stitch through both loops of that V. Then I just pull that yarn. Oh, sorry, my yarn got caught. Let me pull that. So you want to keep your stitches loose for right now. And here I am going through the next stitch. This is my third stitch now. And again, go through both loops and then pull your yarn through, and then go on over to the right side and do the same thing. But as I was saying, you want to make sure that you keep your stitches loose for right now. It's okay, you don't have to pull super tight. I'm going to show you how to do that, but you want to go ahead and get about an inch or so whenever you are stitching together, and then we'll pull it tight. So here I am on the right side. I went through that next stitch and I'm going over to, oh, I'm sorry, that was the left side. Now I'm on the right side and pulling that through. Sorry, doing two things at once. Talking is kind of hard to do this too. So here, I think I'll do one more stitch. So I went from the back to the front of this stitch. So now I think I have enough stitches done, and now I'm going to show you the magic of this seaming technique. It's really cool. So you're going to want to tug on the yarn that is on the loose side, and you're just going to gently tug on it. And you want to make sure that you hold down both sides of the fabric. That way you can actually pull the stitch through. But you can see as I'm pulling that yarn is just sliding right into the stitches, and you can't even notice that it's there. Now right here I do still have a little bit loose, and then it's tighter at the top, so I need to keep pulling. And you can see I just closed up that stitch. But I also like to pull it and stretch it just a little bit, because I don't want my shoulder seams to be too tight. Otherwise, I'm constricted while I'm wearing it. So that's why you see me occasionally, I'm going to be tugging on it just to keep that yarn a little bit loose, so that whenever I put my cardigan on, it fits over my shoulders. So I left off on the left side, and now I want to insert my needle into the right side of that stitch. So I'm again just going from the back to the front and then pulling my yarn through, and then I zigzag my way over and I insert my needle from the back to front on the next stitch. So you will see that the yarn, since it's looser, it will look kind of like you're lacing up your shoes. So watching me seam like this kind of is probably a little bit boring, but I know that it is helpful to see this in action. So this is a great time to mention that if you have found this video helpful so far, I would really like it if you hit that like button and then leave a comment. Alright, so now I'm tugging on it, and you can see that yarn just zip right in there. And since this yarn is the same color, you can't even hardly notice that there's a seam. So that's why I really love this seaming technique, the mattress stitch. It's just amazing, especially whenever you go stitch by stitch. And yeah, it just looks really great. So like I was saying, this can be a little bit boring. I'm sure that you've got the hang of it by now, watching me do several stitches. So I'm going to go ahead and speed through this, and I'm going to work my way up all the way to the top. And whenever you follow stitch by stitch like I'm doing here, you're not going to end up with anything uneven. You'll end up with the pieces matched up together almost perfectly. I can't say perfect because I'm definitely not perfect, but it will look really good whenever I'm done. So I'll speed through to the end, and I'll show you what to do after we reach the end of the row. So here I have reached my last stitch. I finished off on the right side. So now I'll go ahead and take my yarn through the next stitch on the left or my back panel, and this is just gonna keep the seam together. It's gonna meet up a little bit better, so that it's almost at so that's like at a 90-degree angle to it. And then that also leaves my yarn in the back so that I can weave in the ends on the inside of my cardigan. So after you do this and you're ready to weave in that end, just go ahead and flip over the cardigan. That's what I'm doing right here. And this is where I like to this is where I like to weave in my ends. Before I do that though, I like to secure that end just a little bit more. I'll tie it into a small little knot by going through one of the loops of yarn on the back that's really close to where my yarn is coming up from, and then I'll go ahead and insert my needle through that loop to make a knot, and then I'll tug on that just a little bit, and that knot won't be noticeable. It won't feel hard. You won't hardly even feel it or know that it's there. I just like to do that for extra security. It just makes me feel better that my seams are not going to come out. So after this, I like to weave in my ends, and I do quite a bit on the seams. I like to leave a lot of yarn woven in just in case my yarn does end up coming undone, or that seam. I really don't want that seam to come undone, but on the off chance that it does, I should have enough yarn to fix that mistake. So that's why I like to leave a lot of yarn. So whenever I'm weaving in, you'll see that I do this so many times. Sometimes I weave back and forth like 3 or 4 rows, and yeah, it equals a lot of yarn, but it's just on the off chance that I do end up having a mistake, I will be able to fix it easily because I'll have enough yarn. So I'll leave that up to you. That is to your discretion on how much yarn you want to weave in, but that's why this process takes me a little bit of time. So that pretty much does it on how to seam the shoulders together. So after I clip that yarn and hide that end into the inside of my cardigan, let me flip it over and show you what the final seam looks like. So again, this is the inside of the cardigan. You can't hardly tell that we even sewed these pieces together. It looks really good. So that's the row right there that we seamed, and now I'm going to flip it over and ta-da! You can kind of see that the rows don't match up exactly, but it blends in enough that, an untrained eye isn't going to know that that was a seam. But that's why I really love this technique. It just looks really great. It keeps those rows together, and I think it just looks really good. So now you just want to do the same exact thing, but for the opposite side for the other front panel. So now we can go to the seam along the side, and I have my shoulder seam done on this side, but now I want to show you how to seam together the back and front panel pieces. So you want to make sure that you do have stitch markers for this part of the seaming process, especially if you have stripes like me, because you want to keep the rows together, because depending on which side you start with, if you start from the top or the bottom, it doesn't matter. If you don't keep the rows lined up, then at the end you're going to have uneven fabric and you're going to have to rip back. So make sure you have stitch markers for this portion. So I'll go ahead and take my first stitch marker, and I want to place it along that first row to pin the front and back pieces together. And any stitch markers will work. I have these, I think they're called bulb stitch markers, but again, any will work. So I want to line up my hem and make sure that I have the first rows matched up between the front and back panel. Because again, you want to match up every row as you seam, because this will look a little bit different than what I showed you on the shoulder seam. So my cardigan might look a little different than yours. I'll be able to stitch together mine a little bit easier because I know how many rows are within the stripes, which makes my job a little bit easier. Versus if I had just a solid color cardigan, I would have to be counting row by row to make sure that I meet up the front and back panels together so that I have a really good seam. So if this is your case, just go ahead and count those rows. I'm not going to in this video because I have the stripes to really help me stay on track, but just keep that in mind. So I'm looking for that first row, and now I can insert my stitch marker in the front panel, and then I want to find the first row on the back panel and do the same thing. And then I will close this stitch marker to keep that row in place. And now I just want to do the same thing. I am counting along my hem. I just want to keep this, I'm going to go stitch by stitch on this one, just like we did on the shoulder seam, but I just want to make sure that I keep it even. So that's why on the hem I'm adding another stitch marker. But then throughout the rest of this cardigan, as I'm adding the stitch markers, I'm just going to be lining up every single row. And like I was saying before, since I have stripes on my cardigan, I can just place stitch markers along the bottom and top edges of the green, because that's going to keep those rows in line, just because I know how many rows are within those stripes. So again, I'm just continuing to go up the side of the cardigan, and I'll work my way up about 3/4 of the way just with the stitch markers, because I want to leave enough room at the top for the sleeve. So the last stitch marker will signal for me to stop seaming. That way I don't close up the part that I need for the sleeve. Okay, so all I did was flip the cardigan over so that I have the hem at the bottom. It's going to be easier for me to show you this way how I do the seaming. But on this one, I actually did not leave a long enough yarn tail, so I went ahead and wove it in. So I'm about to show you how to attach a loose piece of yarn to the cardigan. That way we can seam with it. So whenever you're measuring out the yarn, you basically want to make sure that the strand is long enough to go from the bottom to the part that you're seaming, and then I like to add several more inches just to be on the safe side. That way it gives you enough to weave in. So now I'm going to take my tapestry needle. So I like to start on the right side. That's just typically how I do it. So I'm going to insert my needle from front to back on one of those that first stitch. Then I'll pull the yarn through a ways, but I want to make sure that I leave enough at the end so that I can weave that part in at the end, just because we won't need this part. We just need the longer part. So now I have the yarn threaded on the right side. Now I'm going to take my needle and go over to the left side. So I found that first stitch, just going through with my needle, and then I'm going to pull. That's a really long piece of yarn. Sorry, I probably overdid it. I tend to always do that, but I tend to think more is better in these instances. So we almost have this yarn attached now. Now I just want to take my needle and go through the same place that I did on the right side. So I'm going to go through that first stitch again, and then this right here is going to create what looks kind of like a figure 8, and this is just going to create a knot that is going to keep the two pieces together, so that then I can begin seaming and not worry about the yarn tail coming out as I seam and pull that yarn through. Here's that figure 8 that you can kind of see, and this is just really what keeps the two sides together and the yarn together in a way that it's not going to just pull out on the other end. So now we're ready to get started seaming. So the hem, the way that it was crocheted, I actually have the tops of the stitches facing me. So I mentioned this before, but we're just going to seam the hem the same way as we did the shoulder seam. So since I'm working with the tops of the stitches, I want to insert my needle from front to back on the left side, because my yarn is still coming out from the right side. So I went under that first stitch where that V is. I went under that stitch, and then I'm just pulling my yarn through, and I can keep it a little loose, remember that that's okay. And then I want to take my yarn or my needle over to the right side, and I'm going to continue the same exact motion where I insert my needle from front to back, pull that yarn all the way through, and then I'll move on to the left side and continue going up. And I realize that not every cardigan is going to be crocheted the same exact way. So this is just what I must do for this cardigan, since this is the way that this one was constructed. Now, I understand that your cardigan might not actually start this way. So I'm going to go ahead and speed through this since you already saw me seam the shoulders together. Since we're doing the same exact thing here, we can get through how to seam together with the mattress stitch the rows, because this part is a little trickier. So now we've made it to the top of the hemline, and so I want to show you how to do the mattress stitch for the sides of the rows. So you can see I'm taking my needle through the chain one, because this is how I switched to the top row, and that's how I added the height. So this one's the chain one, and I'm going to insert my needle from the back to front, and I like to go through that, and then I'm going to take my needle and kind of scoop it to the right like this, and then I like to go through and split the stitch. So I'm going through the center of that V on the next row. So you can kind of see what I'm doing here. And then you just want to pull the yarn all the way through. And again, it's okay if you keep it a little loose. We'll periodically pull on the yarn to close up that seam, just as we did before. So now we're looking at the next row, and we want to keep the rows lined up. And I'm going to go through the side of that stitch, which I pulled up, but I want to go through the back to the front, and then I'm going to go up through the first part of that. It's almost like a spiral line. It's on the back of the stitch, and then I pull the yarn all the way through, and then I'll show you. Whenever you kind of close it up, you'll see that the line from the back of the stitch, it's going to keep those together. So right here, you can see it's a pretty straight line. You can't hardly see much of a difference, especially whenever the front panel is worn in the front. You really won't be able to notice. So I'm moving up to the next row of stitches. So I like to pick up that looser little loop, and then that goes along the side. So I'll show you that one more time. So there's that first stitch on the next row, and I like to go through that looser piece of the side stitch and then up through the center of that stitch. So I'm splitting the V, and then I take my yarn and pull it all the way through. I'm just continuing that same motion that I did with that first row. And now I move over to the right side, and I go through the front of that stitch. Oh, sorry, I can't quite get that second one. I keep splitting the yarn, sorry. So I'm just pulling the yarn through that one again. And now I have those rows met up. So now is the trickier part. So I went through the side, that chain stitch, and then I went up through the center of the stitch above that. So I split the V again, and then I pull my yarn all the way through. And now I have to go through on the side of that next stitch, which is the back side of the stitch. So I'm going through that looser piece, and then I like to go up through that first little loop. It's almost like an upside down L. That's kind of what that looks like. I go up through that spiral part, and then I pull the yarn all the way through. So I'm moving on to the next stitch, which is the front of the stitch. So I go through that looser part on the side of the stitch, and then again I like to split the V, or split that stitch, and take the needle through the center of the stitch. And again, every time I'm doing this, I'm going from front to back, and then I'll pull that yarn all the way through. And then I'll move over to the next side. I'll crisscross over, and then I like to go through the first 2 loops of that stitch. I'll just go right on through, and then I'll pull the yarn all the way through. Which you can see here that I actually only went through one part, but I also found that I like to go through both parts of the stitch. So you can go ahead and take it through both of those loops. And I moved over to the left side, and I'm going through that chain 1 right here. And then I'm going to scoop my tapestry needle over to the right side, and then I will go through the center of the stitch that's above. So I split that V, and then I'm just going to push that up and pull that yarn all the way through. All right, and that's the last row on my right side of the white yarn. And now I'm going to move over to I'm sorry, that was the left side. Now I'm on the right side, and I'm going to go through the side of that stitch, and then I like to go up through that first part of the spiral line that goes through the middle of that stitch. Sometimes it's a little trickier than others, but once you make it all the way through, you just pull that yarn all the way through. And now I made it to my first stitch marker, which means I should be working on the green rows next, and I did well. I was able to keep that white together. So now, yeah, I'm just gonna pull this and show you that my lines did end up meeting up, which is exactly what we want. But again, you're gonna see me, I like to pull on it because I still don't want the side seam to be too tight, otherwise it will affect the fit of the cardigan. So you'll see me tugging on it, and that's why. But yeah, it kept the rows pretty much lined up almost perfectly, but it does work. I think that it really keeps the backs of the stitches together, and you can't hardly see those lines. And then again, since you have that same colored yarn, you won't notice it. So that completes the first section of white, and now I can go ahead and remove that stitch marker and continue working my way up. But I'll continue showing you through the green stripe because I've told you that this stitch is magical and how it's so invisible. But now I'm not going to change the color yarn. I'm going to use the white, and then I'm going to seam together the green part, and I promise you, you'll see that this stitch is almost entirely invisible. All right, so now I made it up to this last green stripe before I get up to the next white. So once I finish this, and I'm going to tug on it to close it up, I'm going to stop right here. I'm not going to weave in my end just yet. I'm not going to tie it off or anything. I'm just going to leave it be right now because I want to switch over and add my sleeve. And then if there's too much room, like I left too much, I didn't go up far enough, I guess is what I mean, for the sleeve to fit, then we'll go back and fix that. But first we want to make sure that the sleeve is on there. So before we go to the sleeve part, you can see that this is the part that I left open, but I want to show you what the seam looks like on the side. You can see that my stripes are pretty much matched up pretty well. But the rows are pretty much straight. They're almost a continuous line, and there's not much of a jog between the two panel pieces and my stripes. So I'm really happy. And then this is the inside of the cardigan, and it basically looks the same as the outside. But again, the stripes still line up. So I'm really happy with this seam. But now let's go ahead and see how we seam together the sleeve onto our cardigan. Alright, so I have my sleeve, and then I have the front and back panel that are seamed at the shoulder and then mostly seamed up on the sides. But again, I left enough room so that I can go ahead and seam my sleeve to the cardigan, and then I'll finish up that hole at the end because it looks like I left too much room. Oh, my sleeve was crocheted in the round, so this right here where the yarn is, that notifies me that this is the center of my sleeve. So that's whenever it's folded in half, I have 24 stitches on each side, just the way that the pattern was written. So the blue stitch marker at the top shows me that that's to 24 from the loose piece of yarn here. So now we're going to start seaming along the sleeve. To seam the sleeve to the cardigan, along my sleeve, the way that it is, or the way that it is constructed, I have the tops of the stitches on the side that I need to seam to the cardigan. But on my cardigan side, I have rows. So I want to match up each stitch to one row on the entire cardigan. So I think my pattern had 24 stitches. I think that's what I did. So I marked halfway, which is my blue stitch marker here. And I want to first attach this one to the top where the shoulder seam is, so that I know where the top of my cardigan should be. So this is where my shoulder seam is, and then just below that you can see those V's, and that is my first row of stitches. So that is where I want to attach my stitch marker, because that's the first row. That's the top of the cardigan, which is where I want the top of my sleeve to be. And then I want to grab the rest of my stitch markers, and I'm going to start adding them along the sides of the cardigan and the sleeve to match up the stitches with the rows. So I like to meet up the rows and stitches one by one, at least at the top, just to make sure that I don't lose count, because I find that very frustrating if I get off by the time I make it from the bottom to the top. So that's what you're going to see me doing. I'm adding the stitches, and I'm just lining up each row to each stitch, and I'm going to do that along the entire sleeve. So right now I'm just working on the front side, but then I'm going to flip it over and do the same exact thing on the back side. So now my cardigan looks a little bit like a mess right now. But again, these stitch markers are just going to keep me on track. So my yarn is attached at the bottom, and it is attached to the sleeve. That's where I left it off. So I'm going to start seaming along the bottom of the sleeve. So this is where the armpit will be. And then I will again go stitch by stitch, row by row, and then I will work my way around to the back side and finish off at the other side of the armpit. So that's what you're going to see me doing. So as we seam this sleeve to the cardigan, we will be using a combination of the techniques that I've already shown you on how to do the mattress stitch. The sleeve side will be working into the tops of stitches, just as that we did for the shoulder seam. And then on the front panel and back panel side of the cardigan, we will be working on the rows just as we seamed up the sides together. Okay, so where the stitch marker is, this is exactly the row that I want to line up with the first stitch at the armpit. So I'll go ahead and remove it so that we can begin stitching. So now I'm going to go up through the side and then up through the center of that stitch. I'm splitting that V, just as I did in the previous section where we were stitching the side seams together. But now I'm just going to pull my yarn through there, and then you can keep it loose, remember. And then I'm going to take my yarn from front to back, and I'm just going to go through that very first stitch, and I can go through the top of that stitch, which is going to be that V. And then I will pull that yarn all the way through. Follow the same pattern again like I was doing in the previous section, where I go up through the center of the stitch pretty much on each row. But then whenever I get to the sleeve, since I have the top of the sleeve or the top of the stitch on the sleeve, I just go through from front to back into the back of that stitch. I make sure that I have both loops of the V on my needle, and then I'm going through that, and then I just pull that yarn all the way through. And I'm just going to continue this whole process of stitching one row to one stitch of the sleeve until I have the entire thing done. And then the same principle applies whenever you have maybe 5 or 6 stitches or so. Go ahead and pull that yarn tight, which I'll show you that in just a second. Let me add just a few more stitches here. So I made it to my next stitch marker, and I'm going to go ahead and remove it, but I do want to remember that that row goes with that stitch. So I'm going through the side of that stitch and then going up through the center of it, and then pulling my yarn through, and then I'll go on to the sleeve side and go through the top of that stitch. I think I'll work my way up to the next stitch marker, and then I'll show you how you want to pull the yarn through. So I have enough stitches now that I'm just going to tug on that yarn, and you're going to see that it starts disappearing. But since this is the sleeve, this is going to be the part that you definitely don't want too tight, because if it's too tight, your arm just will not be comfortable, especially in the armpit area. And you also don't want too much bulk down there, otherwise it's just going to rub on your arm. So whenever I seam and then I like to pull on that yarn, I like to stretch it both ways to make sure that I still have the yarn loose enough that my arm will be able to fit through my sleeve and not just feel constricted. Otherwise, again, it's just going to be very uncomfortable. So just keep that in mind whenever you are seaming the sleeve. This is the most important part to get right. You don't want it too tight. I do understand that there are other construction methods of cardigans. So yours might not look like this. Yours might be like lining up rows, just like we did on the side seams. But I think that there was enough variety in this video that you'll be able to figure out what technique will be best suited for your cardigan and how to seam that one together. But yeah, I'll just go ahead and speed on through the seaming together of the sleeve, and then I want to show you what it looks like whenever we're finished. So here I am. I just went through the last stitch on that armpit, and you can see here that I am done. I'm just going to kind of tie that part together at the armpit, and now that is ready to be weaved in, that yarn tail. And again, I'm just making sure that I didn't pull it too tight. It still has enough stretch. But yeah, now that yarn tail is ready to get woven in. But you'll see here, after the sleeve, since we left room on the side seam for the sleeve, we have this giant hole at the armpit. So now all you want to do is seam that together. So here I have the yarn from the armpit, and I'm just going to go ahead and take that through to the back side of the cardigan so that I can get ready to weave that one in, just because I don't need this one any longer, because I'm going to use the yarn that we left from the side seam to close up that hole. So here's the yarn that was left over from the side seam, and that's why we left it on the outside of the cardigan, so that we would remember to use it to close up that giant hole that we left. I left about an inch, which was actually pretty good. I didn't leave too much, and I didn't have to rip any stitches out, which I always love. So now I'm just going to finish seaming up this side, just in the same way that we did on the side seam. So I am just going through to the left side of the cardigan because my yarn was on the right side, and again I'm going inside to outside, and then I will go over to the next row and do the same thing. I am making sure to keep those rows together. And I went ahead and sped this up right here just because you already watched me in slower motion on how to seam up that side part. So I'm just following that same way of going up through the post of the stitch and then going over to the other side and doing the same thing. So whenever I get to the armpit, where the bottom of the sleeve is, all I'm going to do is pull that yarn tight, and then I like to make a little bit of a knot. Again, it's not going to be hard and you won't really notice it at all, but I like to secure those yarn tails in, because I really don't want to have to redo any seaming or anything like that. So I like to make sure that it will stay put, and then all I will do is weave in that end, and then we have a finished cardigan. So what you just saw me do in this video for seaming together the shoulder, also the side of the cardigan, and then the sleeve, you just want to follow these exact same steps and do that for the other side of your cardigan, and then you will have a complete cardigan that is ready to wear. And I am just in love with this cardigan. I really like the feel of it. It's very lightweight. I think I'll definitely get a lot of wear of it this spring season, but thank you so much for joining me in this video today. I really hope that you found it helpful to actually see me seaming together my cardigan, and if you did, just give this video a like, and feel free to subscribe to my channel if you like this. But for now, I'm going to sign off, and thank you again so much for watching. I will catch you guys in the next video.